My name is Brett Wood. I am the co-author with Felicia Feaster of the book Forbidden Fruit, The Golden Age of the Exploitation Film. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the 1933 film Narcotic, which we're viewing right now. The film was produced by Dwain Esper, and for all intents and purposes was directed by Dwain Esper, even though some sources list a person named Vival Sodart, about whom virtually nothing is known. He or she has no other directing credits, which I was able to find. So it was either a pseudonym that Esper was working under, a sort of a pretentious European sounding name, or it might have been someone with whom he was briefly partnered in the making of this film. Now this note is actually written in Esper's handwriting, and it could very well be Esper's hand that's holding it up for the lens as well. A few seconds ago we saw the shots of the lightning and the cars whizzing by. That's a classic exploitation device, the use of stock footage. When a company didn't have enough money to go out and shoot on location, especially crowd scenes, car wrecks and things like that, they would just borrow footage from another film, and you'll see quite a bit of that in this film and also in Maniac. One of the essential devices of every exploitation film is the title scroll, or a series of intertitles at the beginning of the film. The purpose of this was to position the film as an educational document rather than sensational entertainment. The exploitation films were not bound by the same guidelines of censorship that affected major studio product, at least as far as the production code and the MPPDA were concerned, because they did not subscribe to that organization. The MPPDA and the Production Code Authority were basically formed by the studios, and they had no legal authority over independent filmmakers. So exploitation films were able to indulge just about any subject matter they wanted without having to worry about the production code, but they still had to worry about state and local censor boards, which they dealt with in a variety of ways. And they also had to worry about protest and opposition from social groups, theater owners, and people like that. And so they would have these titles at the beginning which claim this is a film which is going to explore the perils of drug abuse, or explore the dangers of venereal disease. These were frequent topics of the exploitation film. One of the defining qualities of Esper's films is that he often would insert shots into the narrative, into the middle of conversations that didn't really belong. There might be, for instance, in this sequence, someone mentions someone else's good physique or good health, and just abruptly there's a cut to this close-up of a man's chest, and then boom, it snaps right back into the conversation, and it's very discontinuous. And this happens not only in inserting close-ups which have some relevance to what's going on, but a lot of times, for instance, in Maniac, Esper will just cut to titles, just right in the middle of the action. Boom, drop a title in with music, this light and syrupy music. In this film, for seemingly little or no reason whatsoever, he will cut in footage of animals, as we'll see a little bit later on. Esper was not real concerned about producing a film that was seamless and that looked pretty in the classical Hollywood style. In what we today refer to as the classical Hollywood cinema, the major studios were striving for what we now call invisible style. And by this, it means that a film was seamless. It didn't, there was nothing to sort of distract you from the flow of the story. You were not supposed to be made aware that you're watching a movie. There was not supposed to be any editing which challenged the viewer, any camera positions that disoriented you in any way. Everything was engineered so that the viewer was carried through the film without realizing that he or she was watching a film, that he or she gets caught up in the flow of the narrative. And part of this was achieved by downplaying the directorial voice. Directors were meant to make films which don't bear his or her distinctive signature stylistically, but rather that conform to the style of that particular studio. MGM's films were meant to look like MGM films. They were meant to share this common aesthetic. And the same went for Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, and so forth. Esper's films, on the other hand, completely violate this code in every way imaginable. Sometimes you get a little bit caught up in the story, but it's impossible to really lose yourself in an Esper film just because stylistically the film is so all over the place. It's so jagged that things will protrude and catch you and distract you. And the film certainly doesn't have a smooth flow. You're never really lost in the story. You're always being made aware of the filmmaking process. And while many people would say that this is a sign of an unprofessional film or a flawed film, I would argue the contrary, that it's a film which really makes you aware of the filmmaking process. It is pure cinema in that it shows you are conscious of editing, you're conscious of camera placement. And for instance, here where he inserts the stock footage of the car chase and wreck, obviously this footage doesn't fit in aesthetically with the other footage, and in a higher budget film they would have shot their own scenes like this so that it would have matched and it would have been seamless. But Esper doesn't really care. He knows that most people first of all, it was out of the question. He couldn't afford to crash a car, even a nice model car. It wasn't in the budget, so he was going to use this footage which he had acquired on his own. And he also figured that the audience wouldn't care that much. A car wreck's a car wreck. And by the same token, a birth of a baby is a birth of a baby. And it doesn't matter that when they show the cesarean birth here, that it is completely mismatched with the footage outside of the surgical room. Footage of actual childbirth was sort of a hot item in exploitation films. What would happen is exploiteers, as they call themselves, would acquire footage of birth of a baby, also syphilis footage, from medical supply houses who would supply this stuff to medical schools so that students could see what a birth actually looks like, what venereal diseases look like. But exploiteers would get this footage and cut it into their own movies and argue that it was educational, that this is something that, they were on a higher plane than a Hollywood movie. They were enlightening the world about the wonders of birth and the dangers of syphilis. Hollywood films, of course, were forbidden to show things like childbirth. And a lot of even exploitation films got in trouble and had battles with censors over this. But it was a way of showing sex or showing sexuality without actually depicting it. They knew they could never actually show two people having sex, but you could show a naked body giving birth. You could show a naked body, covered with chancre sores from gonorrhea. And that was the closest people could come. And it was also a popular thing to have jungle films. You couldn't show, a naked person under ordinary circumstances, but you could, if you took an African American woman, put her in a grass skirt and pretended that she was in Africa, you could show a naked person. That by veiling prurient things in a cloak of enlightenment, by saying it's educational, by saying it's, I'm making an ethnographic film, even though it's obvious it was shot in California somewhere, or by saying I'm making an important film about the dangers of drug addiction, even though there's going to be lots of crazy sex and drug use and things which ordinarily violate the code. It was okay because it was done in the name of education. And there was a certain amount of educational value to these films, even though it was kind of done pretty ruthlessly and for the blatant purpose of making money. These guys weren't really out to change the world and enlighten society. But they were providing the public with something that they weren't able to get elsewhere. They couldn't see Hollywood films on the subject of prostitution, birth control, and later on you had films about polygamy and child marriage and all sorts of topics like that. And where was the person to go to get this kind of education? It was illegal to discuss birth control. And an earlier Dwain Esper film, Modern Motherhood, actually later Dwain Esper film, Modern Motherhood, was about birth control, but they never actually said birth control. They never went into detail. But it was about modern motherhood, about a man and a woman who are married but decide not to have children. And you're just supposed to understand what that means. But these were things which people were not allowed to see, but they were very curious about. Exploitation films were some of the only ways people could see what childbirth looks like. I mean, at the turn of the century, babies were born in people's homes, and the family was very involved in the process of birth and in the process of death. By the 1930s, all this had become institutionalized. If a woman was pregnant, she went to a hospital, and then a week later she comes home and she has a baby in her arms, and it's still a mystery how it actually happened. So exploitation films responded to people's natural curiosity about these bodily functions. They didn't always respond to these things in a very intelligent and enlightening way, but they at least offered a few stolen glimpses of what childbirth was like and about what the consequences of drug abuse were and the consequences of sex with a prostitute. So even though they weren't really fulfilling a true educational purpose, they certainly were enlightening to the general public and satisfying a curiosity which people had and which wasn't being satisfied or even addressed by the films which they ordinarily had at their disposal. And even though exploitation films were not bound to the guidelines of the production code, as I mentioned, they did have to deal with regional censorship boards. And as part of this DVD, there's some correspondence pertaining to Narcotic and Maniac, correspondence between the producers of the film and the New York Censor Board. In these, you can get an idea of the process of applying for a license and then also what it feels like to be rejected for a license, because generally these kinds of films didn't fare too well when it came to applying to censor boards. And exploitation filmmakers had a variety of ways of dealing with the problems of censorship boards. One thing they would do sometimes is not even submit a film to a board, but just go ahead and show the film in that particular area. They might also show the film and negotiate cuts in the film and then get approval and show a revised version of the film. One thing Esper used to do, and he got caught doing, was submitting a film, making cuts, getting approval, but then circulating an uncut print. And of course he got caught and was firmly reprimanded and lost his license on that particular title. An exploitation filmmaker might also, if he or she submitted a film and it was rejected, might just change the title of the film and then circulate it under another title without a license. So there were a variety of ways of getting around the state censor boards. Showing someone using drugs in any way was expressly forbidden in the production code. What exploitation filmmakers would do generally is take the production code, which again is something which was created and supported by the studios. It was not a government body. It didn't have any legal authority. This is the MPPDA I'm talking about, who they're the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. And in 1927, they composed a list of don'ts and be carefuls, just to warn studios things you couldn't show, and if you do show it, you should be careful and tasteful as you know when you handle it. The whole purpose of forming the MPPDA and coming up with a list like this is to stave off government intervention. Hollywood was under a lot of criticism from social groups, specifically the Catholic Legion of Decency and other groups like it. And rather than leave themselves open to being regulated by a government body or some outside force, the studio said, well, why don't we form our own censorship board and govern ourselves? That way we can still control it, although it'll look like we're being, governed by this objective board. And so that's what they did, and that's what the MPPDA is, and that's what the ratings board today is. It's an organization formed by and for the major studios to make it appear as if there's some sort of industry regulation. Well, these don'ts and be carefuls that they composed in 27 eventually weren't specific enough, so they wrote the Motion Picture Production Code, which got very detailed in what could and couldn't be shown on screen. And let me read you a few samples of what you shouldn't show, and you'll get an idea of how the exploitation film worked. Quoting from the production code, sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden. White slavery shall not be treated. Miscegenation, sex relationships between the white and black races, is forbidden. Sex hygiene and venereal diseases are not proper subjects for theatrical motion pictures. Scenes of actual childbirth, in fact or in silhouette, are never to be presented. The following subjects must be treated with the careful limits of good taste. Actual hangings or electrocutions as legal punishments for crime, third-degree methods, brutality and possible gruesomeness, branding of people or animals, apparent cruelty to children or animals, the sale of women or a woman selling her virtue, surgical operations. And as I mentioned, included in these were the details of drug use. That was another big thing, that even if you hinted at drug use, that you might be able to get away with it, but you certainly shouldn't show the process by which drugs are used, and that's something that Narcotic does in great detail. And Maniac violates some of these rules about nudity, about cruelty to animals. So a lot of times what would happen is an exploitation filmmaker would basically take the production code, this list of things you're not supposed to do, and then one by one go through and do it. Esper was really bad about that, or good about that, depending on your perspective. A lot of films would go way off the subject just to treat all sorts of topics, just breaking every taboo possible. The scene in the opium den, for instance, he throws in the shot of the Chinese man looking at the blonde woman for the suggestion of miscegenation, that this lecherous Chinese man has sexual desires for this white woman, and who knows what's going to happen in this depraved opium den. So he never missed an opportunity to work in, to break another taboo, to work in another forbidden subject. But enough about the general exploitation film. Let's talk a little bit about Narcotic. It is remarkably faithful to the actual life of William Davies, the central character of the film. Sometimes it's spelled Davis and pronounced Davis. Sometimes it's Davies. But according to what we know, it is actually supposed to be Davies. He was Hildegarde Esper's sort of a great uncle, you might say. Her grandmother was involved with this man, and he was sort of a long-time acquaintance of hers. And he knew Esper, and Esper was very impressed by him, even as he was repulsed by him, because when Esper knew him, he was in pretty bad shape, addicted to opium. This scene where Davies walks by and sees the man selling some product on the sidewalk is one of the great qualities of Narcotic, because it's made outside the studio. Everything's not smooth and polished. You get a real sense of reality. You get a sense of what Los Angeles was like in 1933. And even in the indoor sets, which are completely artificial, they're made in a cheap way, and they're made just to mimic ordinary rooms. So it doesn't feel that much like make-believe. Even though it looks very fake, it has kind of a rough, real feel to it, kind of gritty, kind of dirty, kind of poorly constructed. It really enhances the feeling of the film. But talking a little bit about Will Davies, a book was written about him by a woman named Violet McNeil, who was his longtime companion, and the book is called Four White Horses and a Brass Band in 1947. And it sheds a lot of light on Will Davies' background and personality, and it corroborates a lot of the stories which have been handed down to members of the Esper family over the years. And when I had spoken to some of them in the past, a lot of the stories seemed kind of far-fetched, but then, and especially seeing him in the film, I assumed that Esper had exaggerated quite a few things. But it's interesting to read Violet McNeil's account of his life, and a lot of the things do jive up, that it is a pretty straightforward and not too aggrandized account of Davies' life. The scene where they bring in the drug addict into his doctor's office is interesting, because what they pull out of one of his pockets, just the suggestion, you don't even have to know exactly how he planned to use it, but just to see this sort of the primitive works that come out of his pocket is pretty repulsive. He has an eyedropper and a safety pin. And what some people would do, because hypodermic needles were not commonly available at the time, a drug addict would put some drug in the eyedropper, then take the safety pin and gouge in his or her arm until they opened a vein. And then once the vein was open, take that eyedropper and insert it in and squeeze as much drug as they could into the vein, and then kind of work it around to get it into the bloodstream. So it's not, he doesn't call too much attention to it, but just the shot of the eyedropper and the pin are pretty frightening. Will Davies came from Wisconsin. He had an unhappy home life and eventually moved in with another couple. The husband of this couple often traveled, and one time in his absence, according to Violet McNeil, Will was seduced by the woman, Mary. And if I'm not mistaken, Mary is Hildegarde Esper's grandmother, if I have my lineage correct. Well, the husband came back into town. There was a big blow up. And anyway, the two of them left town with her two children and moved into Chicago. And she got a job doing housework, and then he took a job as a delivery boy for a local drugstore. And Violet McNeil talks a little bit about his early years, and it hints at how he was sort of drawn into this seedy world, which he later came to thrive. And she says, quote, "The drugstore was on the edge of Chicago's red light district. His deliveries were restricted to this area and some office buildings nearby. Will was a rosy-cheeked, black-haired young fellow with a way about him. He became a favorite with the prostitutes and even their pimps and associates. While delivering medicine, he came in contact with Dr. Lop Chung, who was immediately attracted by Will's inquiring mind. The liking increased, and the cultured Chinese had long talks with the alert boy, eventually hiring tutors to provide him with a classical education. Will continued his studies throughout his life." Well, Lop Chung, whom she refers to, is Ji Woo in the film. The film Narcotic and the book Four White Horses and a Brass Band differ a little bit on the character of Lop Chung, or Ji Woo as he's called in each one. But they both sort of agree that he seems to have been the one who introduced Will Davies to opium, although the book leaves it a little bit vague. Here's what Violet McNeil says. "Will himself had begun smoking opium when he was about 18. Whether he was started by the Chinese doctor who was an addict or by someone in the red light district, he never said. His start in the medicine business, however, was easily traceable. While strolling home one day, he observed a man lecturing on a street corner with such energy that a crowd had collected. The youthful Will, his imagination caught, remained long enough to watch the speaker offer for sale tins of salve at 50 cents and quickly collect $6 or $8. Will rushed back to Dr. Lop's office and breathlessly described the incident. 'I can do it just as easily as he did,' he exclaimed. 'I know it.' In the movie Narcotic and also in the book Four White Horses and a Brass Band, the Asian man's character is essentially the same. He is sort of this wise person who both shares Will Davies' fondness for opium, but he's also sort of a voice of reason, even though in the book he's an opium addict, and in the movie he says he just smokes tobacco. But he offers lots of sort of objective perspectives into drug addiction in America. And this scene is kind of interesting because a lot of time in exploitation films, you would have a voice of authority who would come in and then offer sort of a mini lecture. For instance, Reefer Madness, you have the leader, Dr. Carroll, speaking to a parent-teacher organization about the perils of drug use. Glen or Glenda, you have the psychiatrist explaining what it truly means to be a transvestite. And you have films with policemen directly addressing the camera, mayors giving speeches to the city council. A lot of times you will have a voice of authority sort of putting forth the message of the film. So a scene like this sort of fulfills the same purpose as the title scroll at the beginning of the film, where it establishes the film's educational nature and accomplishes its educational goals. From that point, the film is then free to go in whatever direction it wants, because it can show the wages of sin in as much detail as it wants to, as long as it provides the necessary educational message, which it has now just done, and thereby earned the right to indulge in whatever form of debauchery William Davies decides to go towards.
In case of those unfortunate enough to have acquired the habit, the hope for a cure lies in the individual. It cannot be accomplished by re-drugging. The only cure is the will to be cured.
The shot of Dr. Davies in his home with all the Asian furniture and the curtain is very nice, and he sort of uses the Oriental motif to underscore his opium addiction, and also that he has sort of drifted away from Western medicine and modern science. No longer is he in the white laboratory, no longer wearing the surgical garb. He's now wearing a silk robe with an opium pipe, in a room decorated, rather than with the Oath of Hippocrates, decorated with Oriental furnishings. And there's an indication of this earlier on, where at his desk he's got a little statue of Buddha sitting on it. It's meant to suggest a corruption from medicine, modern medicine, to this sort of opium-influenced sort of snake oil medicine, which he later goes into as his calling. So we go from one extreme to the other here, from the clever use of set design and mise-en-scène, showing the office with the Asian influence, to one of the quintessential bad American film shots, the shot through the back of the fireplace, the perspective that no one could possibly have. It's often referred to as just the shot you should never have in a film. But yet in this film it almost works, because on one level it's suggesting the fire of Davies' drug addiction. He's in his own personal hell. And also with a film this extreme, anything goes. You can put a camera on the ground looking straight up someone's pant legs. You can put a camera in the back of the fireplace. It really doesn't matter. This is a film which is pulling out all the stops. It's not governed by the laws of invisible style. Classical Hollywood cinema, none of that stuff is in effect here. This is strictly cinema from the gut. It's kind of an intuitive, visceral cinema where Esper is not coldly calculating how he wants each shot to look and how he wants the film to progress and be constructed. It's just, the impulse to put a shot there, the shot goes there. The impulse to put the camera down there, it goes there. And if it doesn't flow together seamlessly in the editing room, then so what? That's just how it's going to be. And speaking of things not flowing together, at this point the film kind of lunges ahead in a couple of different directions, and it's almost hard to keep up with what's happening in the narrative. One minute he is in the fireplace breaking his opium pipe, then he's convalescing in a hospital, and then the next thing you know he's a doctor again, and unfortunately he has chosen as his taxi driver a drug addict who eats a vial full of morphine, and as we will see in a little bit, in a flurry of mismatched stock footage, send Dr. Davies back to the hospital and back to his own drug addiction. The story of this film was credited to A.J. Carnop, but it bears sort of the earmarks of a Hildegarde Esper script, especially in the dialogue. And also, just the feel of the film is pure Esper, that other of his films have other writers credited, but in an Esper film, his style sort of overwhelms anyone else's attempts to do anything artistic or fluid in the narrative, because by the time he started directing it and editing it, it had the look and feel of an Esper film. So even though A.J. Carnop is listed as the writer, a lot of the dialogue indicates that Hildegarde Esper wrote it, of course with Dwain Esper's influence as well. While she wasn't an expert at crafting narrative in the Hollywood style, She was actually quite a clever writer, and this comes through in several of the scenes, specifically the one at the beginning where the students are sitting around talking, and also the one where where Ji-woo is talking to the head of the narcotics board. The things that are being said are well worded and clever and insightful. The only problem is they don't make for good movie dialogue. They don't flow well. They don't sound good to the ear. It's something that would be a lot better on the printed page where you could ponder it and have time to digest it, whereas in a film these lines are just sort of buzzing by really quickly and you don't have time to absorb every line, and so the meaning of it gets lost and the quality of the writing is easily overlooked. But she was a good writer. It's just that she didn't necessarily have what it takes to be a good Hollywood screenwriter, that writing for the ear. By this point, poor Dr. Davies is now showing a little bit of his the ruination of morphine and opium addiction. You'll notice they've added a little bit of makeup to his cheeks to give him that sunken look. In real life, the real life Dr. Davies used to put rouge on his cheeks to give him that boyish look. Even when he was starting to get gray and withered from addiction, he would still continue to put the red rouge on his cheeks, which must have been quite a sight. So, Hildegarde Esper had a fair amount of exposure to Will Davies. In fact, she even toured with him on his medicine show circuit for a while. I assume that Hildegarde and her mother were living with him for a time. I had heard stories about how, yes, she used to travel with him and stand on the back of a truck with, a snake wrapped around her and dance while he sold medicine. And of course, I was a little skeptical about all this until Esper's grandson, Mark Woods Jr., showed me a photograph of Hildegarde Esper, probably about 7 years old, completely nude, wearing nothing but a giant snake around her neck, which is a pretty bizarre image and confirmed all these wild stories that I had heard from various family members. The carnival setting here is a little bit in tribute to Will Davies, who toured medicine shows a lot of times which sort of had a circus-like feel. It was not just selling tiger fat or some other elixir, but there would be a show involved. It would be like an entertainment, a circus, a mind-reading act he used to do with Violet McNeil. It's also an homage to Dwain Esper's own background. When he first met Hildegarde, he was working as a motorcycle daredevil, believe it or not, under the name Fearless Chick of the Motordrome. And out in Los Angeles, he would ride this motorcycle up the vertical walls of a wooden motordrome. Occasionally, Dwain Esper is capable of really surprising you with an image, and this is probably the best example from Narcotic. Whether it happened by accident or whether it was something he experimented with and found, but this shot is incredibly haunting for reasons which don't come easily in words. It reminds me a lot of something you would see in a Kenneth Anger film, something about the way the light is limited to that one little narrow beam, and the camera very smoothly tracking around these cages, and just there's something very depraved about the skinny cat licking itself amidst all these caged reptiles. In her book, Four White Horses and a Brass Band, Violet McNeil gives a little bit of the actual pitch that she used to use to sell tiger fat. Tiger fat is the ointment which the real-life Will Davies sold, and the Will Davies in the film as well. Quoting from Four White Horses and a Brass Band, "Tiger fat, which was simply a cheap salve, had been Will's specialty. He had done so well with it that tiger fat had become his nickname. Your pitch," Will continued, "will go something like this. A visiting prince came to go on a tiger hunt with your family. When he was in the back country, he wounded a tiger, which mauled him badly. The tiger was killed by one of the retainers. There was no medicine available, however, and when infection set in, the prince's life was despaired of. One of my relatives, you will say, had the tiger skinned and cut up. He took the backbone of the royal Bengal tiger, chopped it up, put it in a pot, and rendered the fat and marrow. With this substance he anointed the injured prince, who made a miraculous and rapid recovery. Further investigation of the curative powers of this tiger fat was made, and it was discovered to be of great value for cuts, bruises, burns, rheumatism, backache, and other ailments. The price of the Vital Sparks is $5. The price of the Tiger Fat is $1. To everyone who buys the Tiger Fat for $1, we're going to make a present of the $5 package of Vital Sparks, so you can all discover for yourselves what they will do. Vital Sparks was a product where they took candy, what they call buckshot candy, put it in a drawer or a bucket, and covered it with alum to give it a bitter taste. So even though it was just candy, they would put it in a little package and sell these as Vital Sparks, that they will rejuvenate your personal energy. Millicent Esper, who was Dwain and Hildegarde Esper's daughter, carried on the legend that Tiger Fat was eventually sold to Vicks, and that the product Vicks Vapor Rub is actually the Tiger Fat, which Will Davies invented. But I don't think that's true, because if you compare the contents of Vicks Vapor Rub and the ingredients of Tiger Fat, which Violet McNeil reveals in Four White Horses and a Brass Band, you can see there are a little bit of discrepancies in the formula. She describes the process by which she made Tiger Fat in the bathroom of a hotel somewhere when they're out on the road. Our Tiger Fat had Vaseline as its base. We melted the Vaseline in a large bucket over a burner, adding gum camphor, menthol crystals, oil of eucalyptus, turpentine, and oil of wintergreen. We shaved paraffin into the mixture to make it set. Constantly stirring it, we got the medicine good and hot. The round tin boxes we spread out on a big table. Then we poured the hot mixture into a tin coffee pot for convenience in handling and filled the tin boxes. The labels described it as Tiger Fat, to be used as needed. It was an effective remedy for almost every ailment the flesh was heir to. This scene is one of the highlights of Narcotic, the authentic in every detail drug party, and it was hyped as such in the ads, and it takes up a lot of screen time, but it's worth it. Like the scene of the showgirls dancing around the apartment room in Maniac, it's just an indulgent, extended sequence strictly there to amuse and entertain the audience. Although while in Maniac he never argued that seeing a bunch of girls in their underwear prancing around and telling jokes had some enlightening value, here he has a title explaining that a lot of research has been done to actually show you what this whole drug culture is about and what a drug party really looks and sounds like. And I imagine a lot of people took it seriously, and who knows, maybe we should take it more seriously. Maybe he actually is revealing some of the drug lingo that has now fallen out of use, although it sounds a little too slangy to be real. And the great thing about it is like an all-you-can-eat bar of drugs. They have every possible drug. They use every possible term for drug usage. It's just a cornucopia of outdated drug terminology and expressions. But it's incredibly entertaining because the jokes come fast and the variety of drugs is almost never ending.
Well, it's the Mexican route for you, eh? Say, don't you know what it means to get the ding?
You're telling me I don't know how to handle my sweet marguerite?
No formality here. No.
Looking at it today, the sequence is on the tame side, but in a few minutes you see the guy putting the hypodermic needle actually into his arm. And it was about 40 years before Hollywood actually would show something like that, because that was just unthinkable. I think it was probably the Panic in Needle Park that first broke that barrier and actually showed the methods of preparing and injecting heroin. But the film was heavily censorable for this sequence and others like it, the birth of a baby sequence. In fact, when they submitted it to the New York Censor Board, they were rejected. Hildegarde Esper appealed it. They were rejected again. And she prepared a very long document taking everything that they objected to in the film and then showing where it had also appeared in some major Hollywood film that had gotten approval, and so why was this film being discriminated against? Well, she did a lot of exaggeration. The films that she referred to certainly didn't show drug use and prostitution and other things in quite the detail that Narcotic shows them. This film was way ahead of what even the risque films of the pre-code years were showing. But that's a fascinating document, and the full text is in the book Marijuana, Motherhood, and Madness, where I reproduce the correspondence between her and the censor board, and then their response to her complaint. But occasionally they could get lucky and not have to worry about the censors. They didn't even bother submitting this to the MPPDA to get a seal from them. They knew it was beyond consideration. And like I mentioned, the New York Censor Board banned it. But Dwain Esper told a story to his grandson very late in life, actually just a few months before he died, about how he played the film in Boston and how he was able to get a license to exhibit the film. And I will quote Dwain Esper himself now. He says, "I screened it for the censors. I paid my fee, sent the film to be screened, and I was out in the hall pacing up and down. Pretty soon out comes some dude, hollered up to the guard there, 'Where's the man that submitted this picture?' He said. 'I want him arrested and I want to confiscate the print. Lewd, indecent, immoral, sacrilegious, tend to corrupt morals, incite to crime.' So I quietly stepped out the side door and I said to some guy there, I says, 'Where's the mayor's office?' I finally got over to the mayor's office and I had a hell of a time getting a note sent in. Finally I told them, I said, 'Somebody's going to get fired if they don't take that note and at least tell the mayor that I was here.' When the note got in there, he come through the side door of his office and said, 'Dwain, come on in here.' He run everybody out. He pushed a button and out come a circular bar. We started drinking. It was lush, first class. He said to me, he said, 'Looks like you've got a little problem.' I said, 'Yes, I have. I don't know whether you can help me or not, but I brought a picture called Narcotic up here and sent it to the censor board, and now they're looking for me and they want to confiscate the print and they want me arrested.' He said, 'Is that all?' He pushed a button and some guy come in and he says, 'Go over to the censor board and get Mr. Esper's print and get a permit.' While the guy was bringing my print over, he said, 'You want a date now quick, don't you?' He was pretty sharp. I said, 'Yeah.' So he called a friend in the Tremont Theater right on the Commons and called him and said, 'I got a friend here that's got a picture called Narcotic. He's got a 7-day permit and he needs a date quick.' He says, 'How about Friday?' I say, 'Swell.' I got the advertising and he had a sign made, 50 feet long and about 10 feet high. Narcotic. From heaven to hell with a hophead. You can take it out of the body, but you can't take it out of the mind. We played 17 or 18 or 20 weeks right there. No bother, no trouble, no nothing. When it was all over, I wanted to give Jim something for his campaign. He said, 'Nope. Friends I don't accept anything from. From bad friends I accept.' So we went out to his house for dinner, up the river about 20 minutes, stayed all night. I stayed for the opening. We did a hell of a business in Massachusetts. First time any sex picture, sensational picture, was in Massachusetts." End quote. A lot of times later in life, when the Espers would talk about the films that they had made, they would refer to them as sensational pictures. They were kind of downplaying the exploitation quality of them because they had sort of attained a certain amount of respectability late in life. They were active in the sort of steak and potato dinner club set and moved in moderately high circles, always drove Cadillacs, a gold Cadillac, in fact. So they sort of lived a high life, and a lot of times Dwain Esper would exaggerate what he had done in the past, that he had claimed he had made films on behalf of the government. He claimed to have made Reefer Madness, which he actually hadn't had anything to do with, that he actually made that claim in court in the middle of a lawsuit with someone, and that he had made it at the behest of the government, and the jury completely believed it because he was able to put over stories like that, and he was a master of hyperbole and exaggeration, which comes through in his films, and which also caused him to be something of a notorious figure in the film business. And who knows, he may have been pals with the mayor of Boston and may have been able to get that permit and sort of sidestep the censor board, although I kind of doubt that the film played there for 17 to 20 weeks. Generally, during this time, films would play for one day or maybe for 3 days. A big film might play over a weekend, and occasionally films would play a full week. But it's not like today where films play months on end. The turnover was much quicker. The idea that a film, in 1933, an independent film could play 20 weeks in a particular place is a little hard to believe.
Too much loose talk about large sums of money.
The way these films were generally exhibited is through what we call the roadshow method. Instead of sending out, hundreds of prints the way they do today, you'd only have a few prints, and they would be bicycled from theater to theater. and they would be accompanied by a representative from the company, so that it would play in one city. You know, that night the person would take the print, put it back in his car, get the money from the box office, and then move on to the next city. You know, he would put the decorations in the lobby, give the film to the projectionist, sort of count the money in the till, and then at night take everything down, put it back in his car, put the print back in his car, and go to the next city. That was called road showing. And a lot of times in road showing, they would this representative from the company would also serve as a lecturer, and they would talk about, they would deliver a live lecture either during or after the movie on the perils of drugs or on the perils of venereal disease. And a lot of times, in addition to giving the lecture, they would also sell something, some sort of informational booklet. For instance, one of the real popular things was they would lecture and describe how a woman's menstrual cycle works, with the understanding that by understanding, when a woman's in a certain period, you know when it is safe to have sex without a contraceptive. Because again, you're not allowed to discuss birth control, but in this way, you're sort of explaining how you can have a form of birth control without actually saying that's the purpose of the lecture. This person's just delivering a speech on when a woman is in her reproductive and non-reproductive stages, although the understanding is it's safe to have sex in this time without using a contraceptive, because a lot of people, for religious reasons, didn't want to use a contraceptive. So, the exploiteur lecturer would do things like that, or sell a pamphlet about sex education, what damage masturbation can do to a person, and with diagrams of the reproductive systems of men and women. And one of the things which Esper later claimed that he had done, when he would run out of these booklets, in some instances he had some manila envelopes, and he would stuff these manila envelopes with Life magazine or wadded up or folded up newspapers or things like that, seal them very tightly, and then sell these as explicit sex education pamphlets, or this is the meaning of life. And but the catch is, due to the legal restrictions of the city, you cannot open these in public. You must wait until you get home to open them. And then by the time the person got home, they realized it was a copy of Life magazine, and by that time he had already packed up the car and had taken off. And here comes one of Esper's trademark scenes, just like in Maniac, where you have the cats fighting and the dog and cat fighting when Maxwell goes into the mortuary. Esper has this footage of sort of chaos in the animal kingdom. Suddenly you've got skunks fighting, you've got a Gila monster, you've got two snakes fighting. Of course, he didn't stage any of this himself. This is all stock footage which he sort of acquired on his own. The way he first got into the business was he was involved in real estate, and a real estate deal sort of went bad, and the collateral which someone had put up was this property, which was a film processing company. And so he acquired that and became interested in making films. It later grew into a studio, phonokinema it was called at one time. He also had his own sound recording system called Radiotone, which he leased out to independent filmmakers making westerns. And he sort of became his own little studio head just by acquiring properties and equipment little by little. But anyway, getting back to the subject of the process of the road show. Another key thing about this road showing technique is that it allowed smaller independent theaters to compete with the big theaters which were owned by the major studios. At this time, the major studios not only produced their own films, they controlled the distribution of their films, and they controlled the exhibition of their films. They owned their own theater chains. So all the really good films went to the studio-owned theaters. And if an independent small theater wanted a good movie, they had to wait until it had played the big studio house, and it had to work its way down the chain. Then it would play at a moderate second-run house, and they wouldn't get the film until months later, when by that point everyone had seen it. So it was really hard for a small theater to compete with these big studio-owned pleasure palaces. But those pleasure palaces would never show a film like Narcotic. So the small theater was able to compete. They were able to, show films which hadn't gotten production code approval because they were not studio owned. They were not bound to obey the guidelines of the production code system, so they could show really whatever they wanted as long as it didn't legally infract upon censorship guidelines like an actual state censor board. So because they were able to show this product, which the big studio-owned theaters could not show, they were able to stay in business. And we have many photographs of crowds literally lined up around city blocks to get into these films. They were extremely popular, and what they would do is they would segregate it. The women would see the films in the daytime, and then the men would see the films in the evening. This sort of underscored the educational nature of it, but also at the same time it allowed people to be more comfortable. A woman would be able to watch a film about syphilis and pregnancy with a little more comfort if she's surrounded by other women than if she's in a theater with men who might get a little more rowdy and might view the film a little differently. David Friedman, a great road showman, says the audiences, men and women, were pretty much reverent and respectful, that there was not a lot of jeering and it wasn't all looked upon as fun. People were pretty serious when they came to these movies. But with the segregated audiences, a lot of times the films the men saw could be a little more explicit. They might have an extra reel of birth footage or nudie footage or syphilis footage that the women didn't see. So it's interesting, a film could change from one showtime to the next, from one city to the next, even from one state to the next, because one film might be censored in one state but not censored in another. With exploitation film, there was no firm, definitive version of a film. The titles were often changed. The content was changed. It was much more fluid than the traditional Hollywood film. As I mentioned before, Dwain Esper knew Will Davies and was quite impressed by him. I think that they shared sort of a common bond, that while neither one of them had the benefit of higher education, they both prospered in their own field, and these fields were both not exactly respectable, you might say, but each managed a certain degree of success, and both had sort of acquired an independent knowledge without schooling, that they were pretty world-wise and they were cultured in their own ways. Even though Dwain Esper admired Davies, he was kind of repulsed by the degradation, the physical and mental degradation he had undergone because of his opium addiction. This flashback sequence here is one of the more interesting things of the film. It's sort of ambitious on an optical and visual level. You've got the heavens and the visions going on in the center, but also there seems to be a spinning globe or something happening down in the lower center of the frame, which is not quite clear what is happening. But what's interesting is that in this little flashback, there are a few pieces of footage which don't appear in the film itself. Whether these were removed early in the cut or whether this particular print, which comes from the Library of Congress, may have been missing footage which had been cut out for either censorship reasons or just to shorten it, is not clear. But you do see a little bit of the film that you don't see elsewhere. For instance, there's a scene there where Will strikes his wife and knocks her to the ground. This is very much in keeping with the personality of Will Davies we hear about not only from Narcotic and the Esper family, but also from Violet McNeil in Four White Horses and a Brass Band. Before she became his lover, Violet McNeil was hired to prepare Davies' medicine, as she put it. She claimed to be very naive and to not realize that he was smoking opium and that he had sort of turned her on to smoking opium as well. At one point, one of her friends, Elmer, from back home, comes to visit her, and so she's proudly showing him around her new lavish apartment. She says, quote, "I lit the little lamp, threw myself down, and rolled and started to smoke the little pill. I looked up. I wanted to see the look of astonishment on his face before I told him what I was doing. His look certainly showed astonishment. It also showed horror. 'My God, Vi,' he burst out, 'what are you doing smoking opium?' I sprang up and started to cry and rushed at him, hitting him on the chest with my fists. 'I'm making medicine,' I screamed. 'Get out of here or my husband will kill you when he gets back.' I was still crying when Will returned. 'Will, Elmer said I was smoking opium.' He didn't say a word. He drew back his fist and hit me on the jaw, knocking me completely out." Now, I haven't said much about Harry Cording, who plays the role of Dr. Davies, mainly because there's not that much known about him. He was an actor in lower budget films. I guess his most recognizable role was this zombie-like manservant in Edgar G. Ulmer's The Black Cat. Unlike Esper's more sensational films, it's kind of hard to know what his true motives were in making Narcotic. He seems to be genuinely trying to convey the tragedy of Will Davies' life, instead of just working in every possible vice and every breakable taboo into the narrative. He is relatively limited in his focus. And there are other slight indications that it was sort of a project with some artistic aspirations. For instance, it was produced under the title They, which is kind of unusual, a very vague title compared to Narcotic, which is very specific and very sensational. And I asked some of the relatives what the Esper's motives were in making these films. Were they legitimately concerned about educating America on the dangers of drugs and so forth? And Millicent Esper, their late daughter, said, oh no, they were very concerned with educating the public. My mother wrote a booklet, which is called Your Sex Questions Answered, which they sold not only in the at the screenings, but also through the mail. And I asked Millicent's ex-husband, Mark Wood Sr., and rather than give me a verbal answer, he just gave me this very profound look that said, really, you ought to know better than that.